Lesson 28. You might not need an effect. 1. Introduction. Hello everyone. Today I want to explore a subtle but fundamental idea in building React applications. Sometimes you don't actually need an effect. The article we're looking at argues that effects are an escape hatch, a tool you use when you must step outside React's normal model. But when you can keep things inside React's rendering flow, you're often better off doing so. By thinking carefully about when to use effects, and when not to, you can make your components easier to follow, faster, and less prone to bugs. 2. What is an effect and when it is truly needed? Let's start by clarifying. An effect refers to logic that runs after React has committed updates to the screen, typically for synchronizing with something external, the browser DOM outside React, a third-party widget, a network call, a timer, a subscription. The key point the article makes is, if you're simply transforming props or state to compute something for rendering, or responding directly to user events, you don't need to drop into that after-render phase. Use effects only when you are synchronizing with something outside of React's normal render cycle. The fewer unnecessary effects you have, the more predictable and maintainable your code becomes. 3. 2 common cases where effects are unnecessary. The article identifies 2 typical scenarios in which developers reach for an effect but don't actually need one. Transforming data for rendering. For example, you might think to keep derived values in state and update them in an effect when some other state or props change. But instead you can calculate derived values during rendering. Since rendering already happens when props or state change, this is simpler and avoids extra renders. Handling user-driven events. If the logic should run because the user clicked a button or submitted a form, then the event handler is the right place. If you wait for the effect to run, you lose context. You may not know which event triggered it, and you risk running logic at times when it shouldn't run, for example, when the component mounts. By recognizing these patterns, you free yourself from overusing effects and improve your component flows. 4. Strategies to avoid unnecessary effects. The article then offers several practical strategies to avoid leaning on effects when you don't have to. Compute during render. If you can derive a value from existing props or state, do so during the render phase instead of storing it and having an effect respond when the inputs change. Cache expensive calculations. If a calculation is expensive and you don't want to rerun it on every render, you can memoirs it, with React-provided tools, but still keep it inside the render logic rather than using an effect just to manage state updates. Reset state when props change. Instead of using an effect to watch a prop and then clear or adjust state accordingly, you can restructure such that component identity changes, e.g., by using a key, or you calculate things in render so that when the prop changes the state behaves naturally. Share logic between event handlers. If you have multiple event handlers that must do similar things, share a helper function called from those handlers, rather than putting that logic in an effect that watches some state. This helps keep the cause, the event, and the effect, the logic, closely connected. These techniques help you keep logic closer to its cause, avoid unnecessary render, effect cycles, and keep your code more declarative and easier to reason about. 5. When effects are appropriate. Of course, effects are still very important. The article clarifies when they should be used. When you must synchronize with something external, a non-React widget, a subscription, an API fetch, or the browser environment in a way that React cannot handle purely through render. When data fetching or subscribing to external stores is involved. In these cases, you are coordinating React state with external state, and effects can provide the mechanism to do it safely, with cleanup, handling race conditions, etc. In short, use effects for external system synchronization, but not as a default mechanism for things that can be handled inside render or event handlers. 6. Why making fewer effects helps. Why go through this effort? because reducing unnecessary effects leads to real benefits. Fewer render cycles. If you avoid setting state just to trigger another render, you reduce wasted work. Simpler control flow. When logic lives where you trigger it, in the render or event handler, you can follow the flow easily. Effects often introduce indirection and can make bugs harder to trace. Less risk of inconsistencies. When you maintain derived state separately, you risk it getting out of sync. When you compute it on the fly or manage it in one place, you avoid this hazard. Overall, the code becomes more predictable, easier to maintain, and more efficient. 7. Recap and takeaway. To summarize, if you can compute something during rendering, don't introduce an effect. If you have an expensive calculation, prefer memoization inside render logic rather than an effect that updates state. If you need to reset state because a prop changes, consider component identity, key, or compute during render, rather than using an effect. Use event handlers for logic triggered by user actions, not effects that watch state to decide when to run. Effects are appropriate when you synchronize with something outside React. By following these guidelines, you can keep your components cleaner, your render logic more direct, and your application more performant. 8. Closing. Thank you for your attention. I encourage you to review your React components and ask, do I need an effect here, or can I achieve the same result with render logic or event handlers? By thinking this way, you'll write components that are more elegant, more reliable, and easier to maintain. Let's now open the floor for questions and explore how this principle might apply in your current projects.